Hi, everyone. Welcome to our panel entitled Restless Women. When they were both in their 20s, Cheryl Strayed and Robyn Davidson undertook treks of more than 1,000 miles each. Cheryl on foot along the Pacific Crest Trail from California to Oregon, and Robyn across the Gibson Desert in Australia to the Indian Ocean with camels. Neither intended to write about the experience, but ultimately produced best-selling books based on their journeys. Cheryl is the author of the critically acclaimed novel Torch, published in 2006. Until recently, she also wrote the Dear Sugar advice column for The Rumpus. A collection of the columns was published this year in the anthology Tiny Beautiful Things. Wild, her account of her journey along the Pacific Crest Trail, was published last year. Her essays have been published in the New York Times Magazine, the Washington Post Magazine, Vogue, the Missouri Review, and have been anthologized in the Best American Essays. She serves on the board of directors for VITA, Women in the Literary Arts, and Wild was the inaugural selection for Oprah's Book Club 2.0. Robyn's first book, Tracks, about her journey through the Gibson Desert in Australia, won the Thomas Cook Travel Book Award in 1980. She's a prolific and award-winning travel writer whose works include Desert Tracks, Pastoral Nomads in India, published in 1997. Robyn is also the editor of the Best Australian Essays 2009 and the Picador Book of Journeys. It strikes me that you've both written journey narratives that are also, in a way, creation stories. The journey has not only allowed you to lose yourself and then find yourself, but also, in a sense, to invent and reinvent yourself. Cheryl, in fact, before you undertook the journey, you changed your name. Could you tell us a little bit about that and whether you see the journey story as a creation story, and if so, how?
Absolutely. When I decided to begin my journey, which, as you said, was an 1,100-mile hike on the Pacific Crest Trail from the Mojave Desert in Southern California to the Oregon-Washington border. And I really began that journey at what I think of as the bottom of my life. So many things had gone wrong. My mother, who was really my only parent, had died very suddenly of cancer at the age of 45. And I was married at the time, and my marriage fell apart, and all of these things spun out of control. And I realized that I had to, if I was going to have the life I wanted to have, I needed to start fresh. I needed to reinvent myself. And so in that kind of classic way that we have to do, I think, at various points in our lives, I really looked deeply at who I was and how I could redefine. And as a writer, of course, language was one of the ways that I thought I would use language to redefine myself. And so I made my new last name Strayed and walked into it, essentially.
Yeah. How did you decide on the name?
I don't have a relationship with my father, and when I did have him in my life, he was an abusive person, a tyrant, in my life. And so my original last name was his name, and it was a word that meant nothing to me. And so the new word that I chose, Strayed, for my last name, I wanted it to be a word that expressed who I was and who I wanted to be. And one of the things about the word strayed that I loved is there were so many layers to its meaning. One of them is to be a stray, to be an orphan, to be without a mother and a father, which is truly what I am and what I was. The other is a stray carries her home on her back, and that's what I was doing. Literally, as a backpacker. I was absolutely self-sufficient out on that trail. Everything I needed to survive was on my back. And so there were all, and a stray is also somebody who takes an alternate path, who sort of whacks her own way through the wilderness. And so all of those things spoke to me. That's how that came about.
And Robyn, did you also see this journey as one that would make you when you first set out?
I probably didn't think that way when I first set out, but obviously that must have been working within me. And I think rather than a reinvention, it was an invention, in the sense that it was like forging an individual by doing something that was actually quite difficult and that I had to manage totally on my own. I think I was forging an individual out of these rather unprepossessing bits and pieces.
So you decided that you would learn how, you would train yourself how in journeying with camels, although you had no experience of them. What led you to this point?
Well, what led me to that point? Look, I've been trying to answer that question of why I did it for 30 years, over 30 years, and I honestly don't think it has a straightforward answer. You know, the things that lead to why we make certain decisions are either so multiple that it's pointless to go there, or they're largely unconscious. I mean, there were lots of obvious reasons to do it. I was interested in Aboriginal culture, and that was a way of entering that culture. I wanted to see the sort of mythical crucible of my country, which is those central desert areas. And the camels, well, look, frankly, I knew there were feral camels in the desert. I arrived in Alice Springs in this little town to prepare for the journey with $6. You know, I wasn't about to go and buy an expensive vehicle. So really, the camels, the idea of getting the camels was a completely pragmatic, sensible solution to a lack of cash.
Can you tell us a little bit about the history of camels and how they came to be in
Yes,
Australia?
actually,
Because
it's
that's really fascinating.
very interesting, very interesting. They arrived in Australia in the sort of 1850s, 1860s, really from northern India, what is now Pakistan. And they were introduced into Australia to build the roads and the railways, the overland telegraph system in this very new country, if you don't count the Aborigines. And so they did that, and there were immigrants sort of imported with the camels to take them through the desert. And then when they had built the railways and the roads and so on, there was no more work for the camels. So the camels were let go. And for the camels, they'd absolutely found paradise. And now they say that Australian camels are the best camels in the world. However, they're posing a huge ecological problem there, as most introduced species do. And their numbers have so increased that they're doing a hell of a lot of damage, and they're a real problem, unfortunately, because they're so adorable.
Wow. As I mentioned, neither of you intended to write a book when you started. Can you tell me a little bit about how you arrived at the point of seeing that there was a book to be written and that you wanted to write it?
Me?
You, Cheryl, can you speak?
Sure, yeah. Well, when I hiked the trail, I mean, I was a writer. I was 26, and I was really learning, you know, I was apprenticing myself to the writer's craft, but I was writing very seriously. And at that time, and as I write in Wild, there's this book, this novel I'm writing in my head. And that was the book that became my first book, Torch. And so when I was hiking, that was my intention on the hike, was to have an adventure, to do something really difficult alone. As I said, to in so many ways get myself back on track. I had lost my way. And a piece of that was getting back on track as a writer, but it was never, I didn't want to have the experience so I could write a book about it. So what happened is when I finished the hike, everyone I met, I would tell them, you know, if this subject came up of my hike, they would say, you have to write about it, you're a writer, you have to write about it. But I always insisted until I had something to say about the experience, I wasn't ready to write about it. And I do think that that's true. I teach memoir writing a lot, and I always emphasize that with my students. I think that, you know, we've all had adventures, we've all had losses, we've all had all kinds of traumas and dramas and interesting things happen to us, and that doesn't make a book. What makes a book is the consciousness that a writer brings to bear on the experience. And so until I had that, I didn't have it.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't until about 2008 that I started to think about writing about the hike and did. So about 13 years after my hike is when I began writing the story.
And did something happen to spark that realization?
Well, really just, my idea was to write an essay. I thought I had about 20 pages worth of material about, the hike. And what happened is I started writing this essay and I went, I'm going on and on and on, 90 pages, and I haven't still set foot on the trail. And I realized that I had something big to say. Again, that's the other piece of it. When I say big to say, I mean universal. I mean telling a story that extends beyond my own life experiences and actually is about what it means to be human, what it is for all of you to go on a journey. And so until I could write with that consciousness, I didn't have it. And so I really found it through writing. The writing gave it to me.
And Robyn, how did you come to decide that a book should be written?
Well, I wasn't a writer. I mean, I didn't know what I was. I'd always enjoyed writing, but I had no sense that that's what I would be. Yes, thank you. Sorry, I just got thrown there.
Yeah, I think there's a fellow.
Sorry about that.
Anyway, it's all right, I've got it.
Anyway.
And I actually, the truth is that I had done the journey as a very personal, very private thing that I didn't think anyone would be remotely interested in. And of course that was naive in retrospect, because at the end of the journey it hit the press and it was all over the world, and it became this kind of mythical story. And I was completely unprepared for that, completely unprepared. And my response was to withdraw. And I thought, if I write a book about it, it'll be like throwing a bone to the dogs. And everyone can focus on the book, and I'll be allowed to return to my anonymity. And then, of course, the book became a bestseller, and now there's a film, and so the whole thing just goes on and on and on.
You were traveling with a friend who was documenting the journey in photographs.
No, not at all. No. What happened was that just before I was to leave, I simply had to have more money. I needed another $2,000 to buy the equipment, and I couldn't raise it. So I, much against my better judgment perhaps, I wrote to National Geographic, and they agreed to sponsor me, but that required that a photographer be involved in the trip. And I felt that I had sold my soul. So Rick came out 3 times during the journey, at the beginning, at the middle, and at the end. And I resented every minute that he was there. But of course, he inevitably, even though he wasn't there very much, he became a part of the journey and is very much part of the book. In a way, I think he represented the outside world that I was trying so desperately to get away from.
Did you use the photographs at all in the writing process? Were they helpful to you?
No. For a long time, I was very antagonistic to the photos because I felt that, the whole point of this journey was to be a subject of my own life. And when I first saw the photographs, I realized that essentially what Rick had done with the best possible motives was to objectify me and so I became the camel lady, this blonde with camels and beautiful backdrop. So I tried very hard to distance myself from that. But of course, over time, as memories fade and life rolls on, I look at the photos now and of course they're gorgeous and I'm very pleased that they're there.
Yeah, the reason I asked is that there are some very beautiful descriptive passages in the book that I thought, were very visually driven, and the photographs might have informed that in some way.
No, not at all. Pure memory.
The thing about that, in my own experience too, is I'm going to speak for you, correct me if I'm wrong. We both wrote about this in our books too, is how I think so often the way we experience landscape, it implies this otherness, like that we are one thing and the landscape is the other. And in both of our books, we write about how the thing that becomes home is the landscape, that we are part of it. We are, one of the many wild things in the world. And there isn't that very clear line that I think many of us feel in this more urban life we have, the line between human and other animals and our body and the earth or the mountains or the sky. And there was a real sense of, in my journey, and the difficulty, the physical difficulty of it, the real aloneness and solitude, and also just being constantly vulnerable to whatever was happening in, the weather. It could be hot, it could be cold, it could be whatever it was. We were part of that. And so there was no other. And so when we were writing about it, when I was writing about it, I didn't need a photograph, because I knew it in my body and I remembered it in my mind's eye.
Yes, I think that's right. And I think the whole business of being on your own for such, in that sort of solitude, chosen solitude, which is quite different from loneliness, over such a long period. I mean, it was 9 months pretty much on my own. And I think your consciousness does change. It literally changes. The brain changes. And if you begin with a sense of separateness and a very sort of strong self, over a longer period of time, that self starts to disintegrate somewhat. So at first it's quite frightening, but then once you get used to it, it expands into this wonderful sense of indeed being part of where you are. So there's so the paradox is that even though you're totally alone, you're completely at home. So there's no kind of existential homesickness, I guess. I felt very, very placed and very, very at home in that landscape.
I wanted to ask you about gender a little bit and how that affected the journey that you took. In what ways did it make it harder or easier for you as a woman?
I didn't think about it. I just did what I wanted to do.
She said that
I didn't think about it.
You didn't think about it?
Yeah.
I was very aware of myself as a woman alone. It wasn't, one of the things is before my hike, I had traveled a lot by myself, and I like to be alone, and I decided a long time ago as a girl to feel safe in the world, to say, I am going to do these things even if they're scary, and to really just use almost a form of mind control, like I write about in Wild. When I decided to take my hike, I knew that I would be doomed if I allowed myself to lie there in my tent imagining that every sound was, a mountain lion about to come eat me. I really had to just say, I had to quash those thoughts and say, I'm okay, I'm not afraid. And so I was conscious of that. And I think too, there's no question that I was aware that what I was doing was somewhat counter to the narrative of what women are told to do. Women are told that they're essentially prey, and that we are to be afraid of men, or to be afraid of being alone, or any of those things. And so I just decided not to be. The interesting thing that I found is that I do think too, traveling alone as a woman, nobody's afraid of you.
Nobody's afraid of you.
Nobody's afraid of a woman alone. And so I think that the world was also a little more open when I did need help. People would take me in a way that my male counterparts didn't quite experience.
Yeah, I just add to that I think being a woman, for example, when I lived with nomads in India and traveled with them, I think being a woman allowed me into both worlds in a way that it's more difficult for a man to enter the women's world, whereas a woman has access to both. And of course, there are assets and liabilities, of course.
Yeah.
But still, I think it can be a bonus in many ways.
So there are two well-known books about men doing walks and treks. One of them is The Places in Between by Rory Stewart, who took a 32-day trek through Afghanistan, and the other is A Walk in the Woods by Bill Bryson. And those books are often written about and talked about as books about not so much the inner journey and the self, but the outer journey and the landscapes and the people they encounter. And I think that this is a very stereotypical way of reading those books. I wonder if you could help me deconstruct that a little bit and talk to me about the people and the places that you encountered. I mean, both of your books are interior journeys, but they're also journeys about place and people.
Okay, I'll go first.
And you talk about the Aborigine land rights movement to an
Yes.
extent, and
Yes.
did those journeys?
Well, I think, I hope that Tracks has got as much object view in it as subject view. But I can't imagine, I think the two things are so completely linked. I can't imagine writing without some subjectivity. I mean, I can and I have in different circumstances, but it seemed to me on a journey like that it was so much to do with what I saw out there and what the internal changes were in response to what I saw out there. And I felt, I mean, unconsciously, I think it would have been dishonest of me not to report the dialogue between those two things, I guess.
Cheryl?
Yeah, me too. I'm not interested in writing that doesn't go deep. I think that there's no way that you could walk 1,100 miles alone through the wilderness and not have a transformative experience, you know, a physically transformative experience, an emotionally transformative experience, a spiritually, you know, on and on and on. And so what I was interested in doing as a writer is the thing that I'm most interested in reading as a reader, and that is, you know, the grand work of literature is to tell us the truth, and not just one version of the truth, but the deepest version of the truth. And so you can't do that without writing about everything, about every last thing. And that's what I've always attempted to do in all of my books.
Speaking of you as a reader, you took books along with you on your journey, yet burned them along the way as you finished them. But you were not able to do that with one book. Could you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, it's me and Hitler and Pol Pot, you know, the book burners, right? That's the world. I really didn't burn the books with a you know, a sense of like, you know, disrespect. I burned them because I was carrying everything on my back. And so weight was, you know, that essential, that as I read the pages, I would burn them. But yes, you're right. There's one book that I carried with me my whole hike, The Dream of a Common Language by Adrienne Rich. There were a couple other books that didn't meet the, you know, the fate of the fire. I left James Joyce's Dubliners under a tree, hoping that some other hiker would find it. I gave away exchanged a couple of books with other hikers. But yeah, there was really this book, The Dream of a Common Language, I carried with me the whole way, because it was sort of a Bible to me at that time in my life. I was really, I needed to carry that book on my back.
I took Proust. I read Remembrance of Things Past when I was with the nomads in Gujarat, and every single page of wonderful Proust was used as toilet paper.
Oh no, my goodness. Yeah.
That's worse than burning, I think.
I think so. Kind of think he might have got the joke though.
So both of your books are either have been made or are in the process of being made into films. Can you talk a little bit about what that process has been like?
Strangest experience of my life. So Reese Witherspoon is starring in the film playing me, and we just finished shooting a couple months ago, and I was really involved in the film. The script was written by Nick Hornby, but I weighed in a lot. I was on the set. I was reading drafts of the script. I was witnessing this film being made, and it really is a
Weird.
very particular and strange experience, because there you are watching an actress and other actors reconstruct scenes from your life, not just from your book but from your life, and it was moving and it was funny and it was beautiful. I feel so lucky that I got to see that happen. I think the film, I think any writer knows to lower his or her expectations when it comes to the whole film thing, because a movie is a different thing than a book.
Yeah.
And you have to let go of that idea, and I always did from the beginning. What I made was the book. I'm not making the film. And yet, watching this film being made with such, these people who made it have such great intentions and a beautiful vision. I think it's going to be an extraordinary film. Knock on wood.
Yeah.
Dare I say it? Yeah.
Oddly enough, I had the same experience. I find it very, very weird seeing this person on the screen who is me and not me doing something that I did but in a completely different way. And there just seem to be these elements that is the same, this young girl, camels, desert, hay. But the filmmakers have been so honourable to the spirit of the book, and I think that's incredibly lucky.
Yeah.
And I've also been lucky enough to have this truly astonishing young actress play me named Mia Wasikowska. She is really remarkable, and she and I have become strange friends. She feels like a daughter or I don't know quite what, but there's a funny sort of odd sort of link between us because of the film.
There's so many parallels in your journeys and in your work. I wonder if the two of you could talk to each other a little bit about what you see as the differences.
Oh, I'm in a bad place here.
Well, Robyn had camels. There was nary a camel on the Pacific Crest Trail.
Right.
Though I did run into, there's the scene in Wild where I am walking along and suddenly this small camel-like animal comes running up to me, and it's a llama. A llama that had gotten loose from its
Obviously, our
owner.
fates are entangled.
There you are. But, I think it was interesting because I don't know why I hadn't read your book ages ago, and why not I read your book recently, and I was so struck by how much, we had to say about our experiences that really, the things you said echoed the things I said, and we were very much kindred spirits, on the page and in life. What year did you take your trip?
77.
77,
Yeah.
and I took mine in 95, but we were both, I was 26. How old were you?
26.
26.
25, 26.
Yeah, so we were at the same age, and really, I was also interested, you didn't write about this extensively in your book, but your mother had died young as well. And so much of Wild, those of you who've read Wild know that, really it's so much a book about my grief and my mother and her death and all of that. And so I just felt like that we had this funny, emotional connection all through.
It's really quite interesting.
Yeah.
They've made quite a lot of my mother's death in the film, and I was against that, actually, because it seemed too deterministic. And of course, what happens to you as a child, you use in whatever way, and of course it has a tremendous kind of fuel for the rest of your life in one way or another. But in a way, I was against that in the film because it sort of intimated that you have to be psychologically suffering in some way to do something extraordinary. And I think the point of our books is that really more people should be doing those sorts of things.
Right. In good times and bad.
Yes, and just, extending the boundaries a bit. Yeah. Oh, and of course the other thing is that I did travel with an old Aboriginal man, which was an extraordinary event, a very unlikely event, and I think that formed the heart of my journey in a way that's slightly different again.
Right, I met other hikers along the way, but I never hiked with anyone more than a day or two. So
Yeah.
I was, yeah. Yeah, that was a very interesting part of the book. This is a question I get over and over and over again, so I'm so glad as a fan I get to ask you. I'll ask it for you all. Are you, what are some of how much are you in touch with some of these people in the book? I know many years have passed, but the Aboriginal man, for example, who?
He
hiked-
died.
right.
Well, I went back to see him about 5 years after the trip to find that he had made me his wife. And when you enter an Aboriginal culture, you're given what's called a skin, which means that you're placed in a certain relational category. So your sister, wife, mother, and it doesn't matter if you're 2 years old, you can still be someone's mother. So it's like that. But for some reason, he had made me his wife. And it was a very strange week that I spent in the settlement with him. And when I got there, it was in the middle of the night, and he was sitting behind his wheelchair with his wife, this wonderful old lady, and they were completely naked, sitting by the fire. And when he realized it was me, he leapt up and said, "Kunkaramama," or whatever, mad woman, and he grabbed my breasts and shook them.
Oh my goodness.
And that's when I kind of thought, uh-oh, what's going on here? But anyway, it turned out fine. He died in the 90s, and I sort of inherited his family. So I do go to see them quite a lot. His son is my age, so he's my son. And it's a very tender and, to me, very valuable and unusual relationship. Very valuable.
Another thing I was really struck by, that there's a point in your book towards the end where you say, where I think you're talking about the press is wanting to interview you and wanting to make you, as you mentioned earlier, the camel lady.
Yeah.
And again, sort of the brave other.
Yeah.
And the whole point you said of your journey was to say, I'm no different from any of you.
Yes.
You could all do this if you set your mind to it.
Yes.
And this is so much, on the last couple pages of Wild, I say, if I can do it, anyone can.
Yeah.
It wasn't as if I was, this wilderness expert or this backpacking athlete. I'd never gone backpacking before, actually, which isn't recommended. That I'll grant you that I maybe could have prepared a little bit better, but it's also true that we don't have to be experts to do things. We're talking about walking. We're just talking about standing up and moving forward, and learning along the way. And I think there's such a great power in learning a lot by doing. And so I think that's, I certainly have never written a book that, I hope to have a message, but people are always asking me, what is the message? And the message is, here's something I did that changed my life, that was one of the most meaningful experiences of my life. Something I did that I made myself the subject rather than the object,
Yes.
and that we all can do that. And I saw that so much in Robyn's book as well.
And I think particularly for women, this idea that you can extend the boundaries of the story you've been given of who you are and what you can achieve and what you can do. And so it's not that you should drop everything and cross a desert. It's that everybody has their own desert.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think we can take some questions from the audience.
There's somebody right in front.
Tell us about walking without shoes. I think you might be able to destroy a couple of shoe companies like Nike, etc. Just with your experience. Tell us a little more about that.
About walking without. Okay, so not to spoil anything in the book for those of you who've not read it yet, but my boots were really problematic. I really was in such tremendous pain through most of my hike because the boots that I had just never quite fit me. And at one point, about 6 weeks into my hike, And I should say that, I was really alone. Like the first 8 days of my hike, I didn't even see another human being. I was just completely alone. It was a very normal thing to go several days at a time without seeing another person. So I was out in the wilderness, and one of my boots, I took my boots off. I was taking a little break, and one of my boots fell. I was on this place, on this trail where there was a cliff, and it fell over the side of the mountain, and like far, fell out of reach. And so there I was, days really from anywhere, and even the nearest road, and I had one boot. And so what's one boot without the other boot? It's a useless thing. So I just took my other boot and I just threw it over the edge as well, like any reasonable person would do. And what I did have, I grew up in Minnesota, which is this state in the northern part of the middle of the United States, very cold, very snowy. And so one thing, when you grow up in Minnesota, you have to like make use of everything you have. And one thing I always knew, to always travel with duct tape, which is this very strong tape. And what I did is I made myself a pair of shoes out of duct tape. And I hiked in those, my duct tape booties.
Yay.
Yes, in the front row.
I heard you say that there was a lot of time gap between the time of your hike and the time of your beginning to write your story. How did you remember details?
Well, a number of ways. One of them is just I remembered, and one thing that you do when you write about your life or you write from memory is that process in itself allows you to remember more than you think you remember. The thing I can liken it to is when you run into an old friend you haven't seen for 10 or 20 years, and you get to talking, and suddenly you're remembering things you thought were forgotten. You say, oh yes, I do remember that. And that's how writing is, and that's what happened when I was writing Wild. I also had my journals. All through my 20s and 30s, I kept a meticulous journal. I wasn't doing it for any purpose. I'm a writer, so I always wrote. And so that was really helpful too, is that I had, a day-by-day account of my hike. And you mentioned this interior story versus external. And once in a while, I was a little frustrated with myself because I would look, and my journals were all these, what I was feeling that day. And sometimes I wished that I'd written more like, and the trees were, the color of, whatever. I sometimes didn't note the landscape, and I had to then go back and maybe just do a little research and just to verify, well, what plants were growing along the trail at that place, or and so it was a mix of research, drawing on my own personal archives, and then drawing on memory. It's called memoir because it is very much, it's the art of subjective truth. It's saying, this is my story. I'm going to tell you everything I can possibly tell you about my experience of this time of my life.
Can I answer that also? That it was a very strange thing because I didn't keep a diary or notes. I had 2 letters that I referred to. And then it was, I guess, 2 years after the event, I went to London to write the book. And it was such an intense period writing that first draft. It was like 4 months of being in a little room and not allowing anyone into that room and writing very intensely. And I swear, I remembered every single campsite over a period of 9 months with such vividness. And then as soon as the book was written, it's as if the book ate the memories. And now when I have memories, I sort of refer to the book. It's a very strange thing. Yeah.
There's in the middle row a woman with the blue scarf. Just right there. Yeah.
This is just a follow-up question from the question that you were just asked. Do you think that in a way you relived? I mean, you went on 2 journeys, because going on a hike is anyway going on a journey, and then you after so many years, as she said, you wrote about it, so then you went on another journey. So of course, you were making the details were coming back to you as you were reading your journals, and now you say that, okay, I'm looking at the book and now my memory has sort of vanished, or if I want to remember details, I look at, so really you went through two journeys. I mean,
You,
Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
I think that, so much of writing is making sense of what it means to be human. That's what I do. When I'm writing a novel, it's about characters I've created, and I don't know everything about them, and it is a journey to know everything about them. And the same is true when you're writing, you're just using material from your own life. And so there are all kinds of insights I have about my hike on the PCT that I didn't have until I wrote the book. And that doesn't mean that I created them by writing about it. Is that I did the deep sea diving that writing requires. And you go in and you look at every piece of it and you examine it and craft it into something beautiful. And I think that is, you're right, it's a journey, it's like the second journey. The wonderful short story writer Grace Paley, an American writer, she said that she wrote so she could taste life twice. That there was the living and then there was the writing, and you really do get to taste it twice as a writer.
yeah, I think that's true. Yeah.
There's a woman here. Oh, I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
she was gonna-
I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. Let's
no,
go on to
please.
the next one. I've forgotten the question.
How did you each feel when the journey was over? Was there a great sense that you'd lost something in your life?
How did we feel when it was over? Well, at the end of the journey, I felt extremely confident, I guess, is the right word. But I wanted to turn around and just stay in the desert. And my first experience with my culture, well, I threw up over a fire truck, if that gives you any idea. And I wasn't aware of how decultured or sort of stripped of those things that we share. I wasn't aware of how deep that had gone. And the problem was that I had to be in Washington in 2 weeks to write the story for National Geographic. I'd never been overseas before. So really it was like being on an alien planet and just wondering what the hell was going on, and having a very clear, rather troubling look at how mad the real world was. Yeah, it was, I think the process of going into the desert and losing that sense of self was easier than coming back out. And in some ways, I think I've never quite fully made it, to tell you the truth.
Yeah, we both wrote about that mixed feeling of, feeling really confident and strong and being excited that we had reached the end of our journey and done what we said we were going to do. And then also an incredible nostalgia. I still have a real nostalgia for the trail and for the person I was there and the experiences I had on the trail. So I was really excited to be back in civilization. Civilization, that's where wine is and food and men. I love all of those things. And so I was so glad to be back, and women and people and, music. And but I also missed that hike. Where our stories are very different is nobody gave a damn that I was out there on the trail. There were no
photographers
reporters or
waiting there, yeah.
anyone trying to get me to do anything.
Yeah.
So I just went back into my life and I mean not back into the life I had left exactly. I moved to a new city and but I just basically was me. Yeah.
Yes.
At the back.
Um, I'd like to ask you, would you like to go back on another journey again, and how would you do it? To write
Shall I
another book,
answer?
maybe?
I would do it again in a heartbeat. I would take 3 camels. I'm kidding. I would not. Those camels were trouble, even though they sounded
Oh, no,
lovely.
they were
But I
wonderful.
would
They
do it
were
again in a
wonderful.
minute. I would do it again in a minute.
Well, it's a difficult question for 2 reasons. One is that I don't think the journey I made could be reproduced now, in the sense that these days it is almost impossible to get lost. In other words, the kind of freedom that I assumed to travel beneath the radar, to not be tracked and have GPSs and all of that, and also that sense of privacy in doing it. I think it's a very different time now. And, I'd be a fool if I didn't use a GPS. Do you know what I mean? The other reason is that in my country, the desert has changed very much. It's been totally transformed by introduced species. And if you don't know the desert, then it looks pretty much the same. But if you do know the desert, it's quite tragic to be there, because you realize how many species have been lost, how much introduced crap there is, and of course the whole story of Aboriginal Australia is there, and it's not a happy one. So I go back to the desert with very, very mixed feelings. Yeah.
We have time for one more.
So many questions.
2 more.
Yeah.
Here in the front.
You said that you made a conscious decision to feel safe when you went onto the trail. So I just wanted to, obviously it's a very different situation for me, but I try and do that as well, because in terms of, I will not, I try not to let my identity as a woman allow me to feel afraid. So I try and say, okay, I'm going to make the decision to feel safe. So for you, how did you have to consciously tell yourself, okay, this is how I will be careful? Like the idea of being careful, did you have to, how were you careful? Did you have to, or did you not want to accept that there was a need to be careful, because that would also mean accepting that you weren't safe? Like, how did you balance that? How did
Right. Yeah, that's a great question, because by no means am I saying, just to be stupid about things. I absolutely, in fact, what I did, the thing that helped me feel safe is I appealed to reason. I said, well, are people dying in droves out on the wilderness trails of the world? And the answer is no. We're far, far more likely to die in an automobile accident, or to be, victims of violence in an urban setting, or, So what I did is I really thought, what are the risks that I'm experiencing, that are realistic? And it wasn't realistic for me, actually, to be afraid by myself in the woods. I also, and I will say, it helped me that I grew up in a very remote part of northern Minnesota, out in the woods. I felt it was a place that I knew. The wilderness was a place I felt comfortable. And so I just decided again, when I would have a thought like a lion's going to come eat me. Well, a lion comes and eats people very rarely, in California and Oregon. Once in a blue moon, somebody's been killed by a mountain lion, but it wasn't a realistic fear. And so I just put it down. The truer thing was that I could do this. The truer thing was that if I did do this, my life would be expanded and enlightened. The truer thing is that if I leaned into and depended upon my own sense of resilience and strength and wisdom and safety and humility and all of those things, that I would be able to feel okay with myself instead of sitting there imagining all the terrible scenarios. And so that's what I did, and I did it really consciously. I think people sometimes decide, they'll say, well, I could never do that, or I could never, And instead of just saying, well, actually, usually most of what we say we could never do, we actually can do, And so I just decided to believe in that instead of the other. It is a choice. Thanks.
Yeah.
Yes, over here.
Cheryl, I want to thank you for being really frank and thoughtful and honest about your sexuality during the course of the journey, which is that you really acknowledged the fact that you had desire during the entire course of the trek, and that you were so open with it, and that you were open with your reader, and you were very aware of it on a really heightened level when you were around other men. There were moments where you kind of felt like the one moment where you had the necklace and you thought that this is the only thing that's pretty on me right now, and there were just really beautiful moments where you acknowledged sex, sexuality, and desire. And I'm just wondering, could you say a little bit more about how you decided to kind of bring that element into your memoir and to be so honest about desire as a woman alone, and to kind of share that storyline? And I think that was probably one of the most enriching parts for me in reading the memoir.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Well, as I said earlier, the work that I'm interested in reading, and also the work I'm interested in writing, is that which dares to tell all of the truth, or at least as much of the truth as the writer can know and the reader can bear, which I think is that's limitless. That's I think that the artist's mission is to be the truth teller. That's what you're all here for. That's what we all come to art for and literature for. And so sex is part of that. I think that it's been a taboo for a long time for women to write frankly about their sexual desires or their sex lives or their sexuality. But there was no way that I was going to leave that piece out of. It's not just Wild, but everything I've ever written. It's a thread through everything I've written. It's to me just one piece of being human, whether that gender be female or male. So that was part of my life, and so it's part of the book. Thank you. And I think too, writing. Do you want to speak to this a bit too? It's present
yes, it's
as well.
Interesting, isn't it? That it's very interesting, that comment, because I also wrote quite frankly about sex with the photographer and why I did that. And also, there was another thing in the book that I mentioned, which was menstruation. And I think so many people were so shocked by that. So it's kind of interesting.
What year? Your book was published in 1980, is that right?
80, yeah.
So it's interesting, so my book was published in 2012, and when my writers group read my book, the opposite, they said, why haven't you mentioned you're getting your period? And so I had to put that in, because they demanded it. Yeah, times changed.
Yeah.
You blazed the trail, thank you. The menstrual trail.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes, back there.
Can't hear.
Hold on one second.
It's been fantastic to hear about your journey and the books that came off the journeys, because your interior landscape, I think you mentioned, actually caused you to take that journey. And then you talked about how you were spiritually and emotionally transformed on that journey. And so now you're in a different interior landscape. So how about the journey back? How has the exterior landscape of the world we all inhabit affected you, and is there another book in that?
How is it different? How am I different now?
That's a deep question, yeah. So how have, essentially now, years out after these journeys, what would have been, what's happened in our, how has that stayed with us, or what have we learned from it? That kind of thing, yes?
Look, I said at the end of the book, camel trips do not begin or end, they merely change form. And I think that's right, that life is just this series of camel trips. And so of course one is transformed by everything one does, really. And when it's such an intense event, then that's going to have a larger transformation. But I think, as I said before, being alone in that desert in that particular way for that length of time meant that something literally changed in the wiring. And so I have this kind of double perception, if you like, of the world I live in now. And it has stayed with me, oddly.
Yeah, my hike has also stayed with me, and I think that, you know, the thing about doing something that's physically difficult, such as a hike or the trip that Robyn took, you know, that we had to test ourselves physically, and one of the benefits of doing that is, I think, really learning the simplicity of the forward motion, the simplicity of always taking the next step. And the direction of that next step is always forward. And I think that has all kinds of metaphorical resonance in my life. That there have been times since my hike that I've suffered or been at a loss, or, you know, felt some sort of sorrow, and really I always go back to the principle of that hike, which is one step at a time moving forward, which sounds so, it's almost trite, and yet it's true, that is how it is that we survive, right? It is how we live. And so that's something that's always stayed with me, is the ability to keep faith with the steps, if you will.
And on that note, I think we'll draw it to a close. Thank you so much for your thoughtful answers, and to the audience for your great questions.
Thank you.
I'm sure you'll agree it's been a riveting session with such courageous women. Please applaud once again Cheryl Strayed, Robyn Davidson, and Gaiutra Bahadur.